间交给第一场的两位主持人，我们的讲座现在开始，谢谢大家。
好，请各位就坐。下面我们开始第一场的重大考古发现的获奖项目的报告。我很荣幸和莫妮卡·史密斯教授一起来主持。首先，我们欢迎英国剑桥大学伦弗鲁勋爵和迈克尔·波伊教授两位来介绍史前克罗斯岛城市化与全球化的萌芽，爱琴海地区公元前第3000年的第一次信息革命。请 ，please.
We ready to begin? Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure and privilege to be speaking to the Shanghai Archaeology Awards on this occasion, and we feel very honored to have received a field award. So I'm going to get right on with our topic, which is a very special site in the Cycladic Islands of Greece. So we're talking about the Aegean Sea, and we're talking about as I say, the Cycladic Islands at the inception of urbanization during the Aegean Bronze Age. That's to say, the 3rd millennium BC, between 3000 and 2000 before the Common Era. Here you see the Cycladic Islands, and there is the island of Keros, which is the focus of our work. And at the very west end, on the right-hand side, you see the very small island, as it is now, Daskalio, at the west end of Keros, and that is where our excavations were focused, as well as on the beach opposite Daskalio Island, which is called Kavos. So we've got Daskalio and we have Kavos. And it was at Kavos in the 19th century that these very beautiful little marble sculptures of the early Bronze Age, they're about 25 centimeters high. It was there that these were found in graves, in burials, and as we'll see, the marble sculptures of the Cyclades are one of the features of the Cycladic early Bronze Age. So there is the island or the islet of Daskalio, which, as we'll see soon, was united with Keros by a causeway in the early Bronze Age. The causeway has become inundated since, and opposite on the left-hand side near us is the looted area, which I first had the opportunity of visiting on my first visit to Keros in 1963. And on that first visit, and I had an official permit from the Greek Archaeological Service to collect surface materials, I found all these fragments, these broken fragments of marble vessels, and as you will see in the middle, one or two marble sculpture fragments. So it was uncertain why so many things were broken, and the first impression was that in fact they had been broken by the looters, because the site had been seriously looted in the previous 20 years by looters who were working to get materials to sell on the open market. But it turns out, as we'll see in a moment, that these sculptures were deliberately broken at the time of their deposition, or just before their deposition, by the people who left them there nearly 5,000 years ago. So it wasn't a matter of looting. So there now you see Daskalio Island on the right and Kavos at the west end of Keros on the left, and the waters between are rather shallow. And we believe now that there was a land bridge. There is the islet of Daskalio on the left, and Kavos on Keros on the right. We believe now there was a land bridge at the time in question, and that this was essentially the location of a sanctuary. So there, the circle on the left, the red circle, is the looted area which I visited, which had been looted by archaeocappali, by professional archaeological looters in the previous 20 or 30 years before it came to the attention of professional archaeologists. And so the area that was extensively looted was inside that red circle on the left. And we came to call that the special deposit, because that's where these wonderful broken materials of marble were being deposited around 2500 BC. And then later on, in the course of our research, we found an area on the right, as you see there, an area to the south, with many more broken materials. And so that meant that we had two special deposits, the special deposit north on the left and the special deposit south on the right. So there you see now the special deposit south as it was when we first visited it in 2006, or when we first started to work there in 2006. And so you see a great tumble of stones, so dense that there are no shrubs growing there because we haven't cleared any of the vegetation. That's where it looked when the work began in 2006. And there is the work continuing when we cleared the vegetation and we were digging in this very simple system of small squares with balks between. And it was there that we found this mass of broken marble sculptural fragments and broken marble vessels and fragments of obsidian. So here is some of these broken fragments of marble sculptures. And here are the very, very shattered bits of marble vessels. And it is clear that these were deliberately broken at or before the time of their deposition. That's not the result of looting. And with them were ceramic vessels, also broken. This is a well-known form of the Cycladic early Bronze Age, the so-called source boat. And there is a list of the finds in the special deposit south, the quantity of finds, which, as you see, were very numerous. We had more than 3,000 fragments of obsidian and more than 5,000 source boat sherds. So here are some of the key finds. These are complete. These are not from this site. These are examples from the Cyclades of a complete source boat, a complete footed jar, a complete marble bowl. And this on the right is what amounts to the icon of the Cyclades, the Cycladic folded arm figure. The right arm is usually below the left arm. It's a very simple Cycladic form, and they vary in size from about 20 centimeters up to more than a meter in size. The meter-high ones are very impressive sculptures indeed. And so we were finding fragments like this. So these are what we call the fragments of a Cycladic identity. And here again you see Daskalio and Kavos. And we excavated at Daskalio from 2006 to 2008. And here now on the small island of Daskalio, which is only a couple of 100 meters long, you find some of the buildings which we investigated. On the right, you see at the top of the island, a rather impressive building, which we came to call the Hall, and other buildings around it and below it. So there is the Hall, which you see there, and the black marks there are bedrock. That's the bedrock of the natural marble which constitutes the island, and then other structures there also. And It was at the south end of the hall that we found this small hoard of copper and bronze artifacts. This shows the dry stone walling. On the right, it's very clear. And the walling was of marble, which is a natural basic stone in the Cyclades. But as we studied it in more detail with the aid of our geologist, John Dixon, it turned out that most of the marble in the walling was brought some 10 or 15 kilometers by boat from the south end of the island of Naxos. So it's impressive that this marble, most of the marble used for buildings, is high-grade marble brought from Naxos. And there is the chronology. The stratigraphy suggested we could divide into 3 phases, and these are calendar years BC, or before the Common Era. So this is the 3rd millennium BC. Then our more recent excavations allowed us to investigate the north end of the island, which you see there, with rather impressive walling. And there are some of the key areas. Here is some of the pottery. I'm aware of the timing, so I'm trying to move on. It turns out that all the pottery was imported, and indeed just about everything we find there was imported, much of it from the main islands of the Cyclades, although a little may have been produced on Keros itself. And so the foodstuffs, these are matte impressions, by the way, giving an idea of the matting that was used. And the foodstuffs were in general imported. We had a few ceilings and 1 or 2 seal stones and many beads. And here are some of the schematic figurines. And on the islet of Daskalio, only schematic figurines were found, whereas on the special deposits, on the Kavos side, we had many fragments of those folded arm sculptures. Here are some spools, as we call them, of rather special stones, and there are other interesting vessels too. The tools were of brownstone also, as well as obsidian, and a very frequent find were these schist pot lids, as we call them, circular discs made of schist, or sometimes of marble, and we call them pot lids. There is evidence that some of them were used for covering pots, but it's not entirely clear what the others were used for. And we found 1 petroglyph of that kind, and we found evidence for, first of all, there's the obsidian, lots of obsidian blades, nearly all imported from the island of Milos, not so far away, but some from Anatolia, as you see on the right, which is not only different in appearance, but trace element analysis has confirmed its Anatolian origin. And metal objects, as you see there, and 1 or 2, the scales are different, by the way, are 2 of these objects. You'll see some gold objects at the extreme right of the screen. And so here now you see the sources of much of the material. The pottery came from a wide area. The ore for smelting came from those metal-rich islands close to Keros. The obsidian, of course, came mainly from the island of Milos, and then the figurines and stone discs were of materials that mainly came from the south end of Naxos. So now I'll hand over to my colleague, Michael Boyd, and then I'll finish up with a few words at the end.
Thank you, Colin. So we just want to touch on a few themes of this conference that have come out of our excavations. And the first is to look at this incredible building program, which seems to have begun on the island of Daskalio around 2500 BCE. We knew about the existence of substantial features before the excavation took place. These photographs are from before the excavation, and you can see these very significant walls at the north end of the island, which we wanted to investigate. So when we set out the new trenches for the new excavation, we set them out in order to investigate this northern end of the island. And what we found was that we not only have a substantial settlement here, which is something we had anticipated, but that we have a very monumental and what seems to be pre-planned architecture at the site. So this photograph here, looking at the northwest end of the islet of Dasgalio, gives you an impression of how the site is laid out in a very consistent manner, with more or less right angles, with the same kind of orientation over the entire area that we can see here, which is about a 40-meter area here. So for the prehistoric Cyclades, this is a first. We haven't seen something like this in the prehistoric Cyclades before. So just taking a look at that area which we had been interested in before the excavation, you see those large walls which were always visible at the bottom of the slide here. You see the area that we've excavated to the west of that on the right-hand side of the slide. And in that area, we've got a stairway which is running up, taking us up to a higher level. And then we have the paved area which leads people off in different directions. So one of the key things about building on a site such as this is that since the site is so steep, you have to create flat areas for building. So one of the uses of these large walls is to create these flat areas for building. But if you have those kinds of steep terracing, then you need to have stairways that go in between. So we have found examples. This is probably our most monumental stairway. You see it has collapsed here. But we have found examples of stairways all over the island. And so this shows you how the whole thing was arranged. And it begins to make clear, once you begin to think about it, that what we're looking at here is not a kind of haphazard development through time. We're looking at a very planned development, because if you're going to transform an area, if you chose an area and you decide you're going to transform it from a natural area into an entirely built up area, and the area is not flat, then you have to plan how you're going to do that. So you see an example here of one of these terrace walls on the right-hand side. This is the lowest terrace wall on the island. And just, you see a massive corner there, and that massive corner leads to this staircase. This is the main entrance to the site. On the east side is just above the area of the causeway, which joins Dasgalio with Keros, which is now, as Professor Renfrew said, is now inundated. We have also at the top of the island another massive terrace with another one of these staircases. This particular entranceway is so massive that if it were in a Mycenaean settlement of the 2nd millennium BC, it would not look out of place. So it's, for the 3rd millennium, a very unusual level of engineering. We also have, on a smaller scale but more complicated, we have here a small square with 3 different staircases leading off it, going to different levels of the terracing. We also have drainage systems throughout the site, and what we've slowly come to understand is that in laying out the site initially, they followed the natural drainage paths, and they transformed those into constructed drainage paths, and then they put stairways and paths on top of that, and they laid out the settlement around that. So what we seem to have is evidence for a great deal of pre-planning, and this is what allows us to look at this as a kind of a proto-urban settlement. And just taking our largest trench here as an example of that, you can perhaps make out that there are 3 different levels on which rooms are being built here, with terracing holding the whole thing up, with areas of movement. On the left-hand side, you see those areas with stairs that I pointed out earlier, which continue down to the bottom of the slide. You can't see it there, and they continue up off the top of the slide. We also have evidence for how some of the rooms were used. Here's storage. But the main other theme I want to look at is the theme of metallurgy, because metallurgy seems to be what drove a lot of this expansion at Keros. Keros is the only site in the Cyclades where we have the smelting of ore away from the ore sources. The ore sources are all in the west of the Cyclades. Keros is in the center. Here you see the island of Daskalio. We did a soil chemistry survey of the whole island before the excavation. And you can see that there's traces of copper working all over the island. We've got several workshops. This is one of our workshops, which was completely full of metalworking debris. Here are some of the materials that we found there, including molds made of stone, including blowpipe fragments and also artifacts themselves. Here's another one of our workshops in Trench H. These are the first two preserved hearths for metallurgy that are known in the Aegean. And these predate the architecture in this area, which gives us a clue that metallurgy may have been the first practice going on in this area. This mold was recovered in a small cache of stone tools in that area. This is a mold for a spearhead, and it has a small implement on the other side. So you can just see from our plan here, we have metal workshops throughout the site. We have gold and silver also found throughout the site. Before our excavations, only one piece of gold was known from the prehistoric, from the early Bronze Age Cyclades. We have now found 8 pieces of gold in our excavation. So to just focus on the theme of the antecedents of urbanization, as we call it, we have a number of factors here. We have regional centralization, which is shown by these materials coming into the site, and the exceptional reach of the site. This is the slide that Professor Renfrew showed you before. We have intensification in several areas. Metallurgy, I'm illustrating here. There's also agriculture, which we haven't had time to talk about. There is the aggrandizement and monumentality of the site, and there's the strong ritual component, which is where we started. And that leads us to this very quick historical sketch. Phase A, regional sanctuary. Phase B, proto-urban center of power. And phase C, when it seems to fade away slightly. So just very quickly to focus on the themes of the conference, we have these elements which seem to be used in a Cycladic identity, but the important thing is the island of Daskalio itself. The island of Daskalio seems to become, in the middle years of the 3rd millennium, the most important center in the Cyclades, where all of these materials are being concentrated. People and skills are being concentrated in this area. So this leads us to the question of the phenomenon of people coming together, and Professor Renfrew is going to finish up on that.
We're running out of time, so I'm just going to introduce the concept of centers of congregation, and many important sites, pre-urban sites or proto-urban sites across the world may be described as centers of congregation, I believe, and there are some of the features of a center of congregation, whether we are talking about Stonehenge or whether we're talking about Daskalio and Keros or many other sites. But I want to draw to a close now. So there are some examples of early centers of congregation, one of the oldest being Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and there are others. Keros is one, and Liangzhu may be described as a center of congregation, although Liangzhu, because of the major building works, really has an urban status and can certainly be described as a civilization. So I think it's interesting to make a comparison with Liangzhu and to compare the two. And I want to emphasize that that folded arm figure of marble is the icon, is the characteristic feature of the Cycladic proto-urban civilization, if you want to call it a civilization. There, of course, is Liangzhu, which we'll be visiting in a couple of days' time. And there are the entranceway and the water gates. And there is the characteristic form, as you know, the tsong of jade, which really forms a similar role to the folded arm figure of marble. And by chance, as it were, Liangzhu and the Keros and Keros are roughly contemporary. They're 3rd millennium BC. And this, of course, is the key feature of the Zong at sites like Liangzhu. So it's interesting to compare that as an emblem, as an icon, with the folded arm figure of the Cycladic civilization. And here are many people whom we wish to thank, but I'm afraid we've certainly run out of time, so I must thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
好，感谢伦福士教授和迈克尔·博伊教授。下面我们进入。